Thank you so much, Obella. I am super excited to be here with you all today and just glad, looking forward to a really good conversation, hoping to answer as many questions as we can from you all. As Obella said, my name is Javier Jimenez-Westerman. I am a dean in the college, which basically means that I'm an academic advisor in the college, amongst other things, and I work very closely with the Community Scholars Program at Georgetown. And we're gonna go ahead and let our faculty panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to ask each panelist to please introduce themselves, what their role at Georgetown is, or what it will be. And also just to kind of like get a sense of who we are, what were you thinking you were going to major in college, and what did you end up majoring in college, or how did things end up? And you answer that as much as you can, as well as you can. I think we should start with Professor Wesley-Nero.
Thanks, Javier. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Sabrina Wesley-Nero. Here on campus, I direct an undergraduate program in education, inquiry, and justice. It's the interdisciplinary study of education in the ways that it has been a tool for justice and in ways that it has not been a tool for justice. I'm also the assistant director of a graduate program on campus in educational transformation, which holds the university's first teacher certification program, along with preparation for people who want to go in advocacy and policy and education at the graduate level. So those are the courses I teach, and I do research with communities as they engage with education, particularly communities of color and communities of linguistic diversity as well. I actually attended Georgetown as an undergraduate student, and I studied Latin American and international relations. My goal was to work in Latin America for the rest of my life. That was my 17-year-old dream. I took a pit stop to teach using the Spanish skills that I developed, and I found myself in the field of education, mostly in bilingual education and ESL education, and eventually found my way back to the Hilltop.
Heidi, if you could go ahead.
Hi, folks. I'm Professor Heidi Elmendorf, and I am a faculty member in the biology department at Georgetown. I'm also the director of the region's STEM Scholars Program, which is part of the Community Scholars Program. And I'm the director of an R&D unit on campus called the Hub for Equity and Innovation in Higher Education. So I wear a number of hats. This is my 22nd year at Georgetown. I'm a proud Georgetown Hoya, not like Professor Wesley-Nero by like where I attended school, but I feel 22 years, and this is from our last NCAA run, so I'm still wearing this shirt with pride today. Let's see, when I went to college, I wanted to be a biology major, and since I've turned out to be a biologist, that all seems like it's in alignment. But I wanted to be a biology major because I wanted to be a farm veterinarian. And that obviously didn't happen. I still love cows, like weirdly and deeply, I love cows. But I started teaching kind of on the side to make some money when I was in graduate school, and I just absolutely fell in love with teaching. And that's how I ended up here as a professor. And my research is mostly in the area of infectious disease. So not viruses, which are super cool and hot this year. The sort of diseases you can't really talk about over dinner because I research diarrheal disease.
Thank you, Professor Elmendorf. Professor Brown, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nadia Brown. I am sort of like an oddball out. I am a professor at Purdue University, but I will be joining the faculty at Georgetown this fall. So greetings from Indiana. I am an associate professor of political science and African American studies. In the fall, I will be a full professor in the government department and the director of women, gender, and sexuality studies. And yeah, I knew I wanted to be a political scientist since the 4th grade. I am like true nerd. Poli-sci runs deep, and I couldn't think of anything else I'd rather do. So this is what I wanted to do since I was around 10, and I've been doing it almost 30 years later.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Brown. Professor Shelbi Meissner, and I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but if I didn't, please correct me.
Yes, Nadia Brown. Everyone, I'm Shelbi. I am a assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown. This is the end of my second year here, so I'm still pretty new. And I feel like the last year, we're gonna not count it as a time that I learned as much as I probably should have about navigating the campus, but I'm learning. I love it so far. I work in Indigenous epistemologies, Indigenous resistance movements, lots of work on language revitalization, justice movements, data ethics, intergenerational trauma, all kinds of stuff that falls under Indigenous epistemology. And I teach classes in Indigenous philosophy as well as philosophy of language courses, graduate seminars on philosophies of language and linguistic justice. When I was in high school going into college, I remember thinking I wanted to study philosophy, even though I didn't know what it meant. I just wanted to like wear black and look cool and like drink coffee and think about deep stuff. And I do wear a lot of black still, but I don't know that I had a perfect picture of what philosophers did. I did end up majoring in philosophy, and every time I took a class outside of philosophy, I loved it just as much. So I ended up getting a triple major in philosophy, English, and linguistics, and I had to fight for that. I remember I took 27 credit hours in one semester. I was a pain in the side of the administration as an undergrad, so I don't regret any of it, and I don't necessarily encourage all of it, though. Thank you. Excited to be here.
Thank you so much. Professor Taylor, please.
Thanks, Javier. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Scott Taylor. I have been at Georgetown since 2000, so I'm a year behind Professor Elmendorf, I think. I am a faculty member in the School of Foreign Service. So I don't know how many of you are potential SFS students, but we teach everyone from every campus, so I look forward to welcoming all of you to Georgetown and hopefully to some of my classes. I am a political scientist by training, although I didn't think of it from the 4th grade. I'm not like Professor Brown. So I am currently the Vice Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Foreign Service. It's a role that I took last August. Prior to that, I was the director of the African Studies program in the School of Foreign Service. So now I'm a dean, but I'm still teaching and have taught every year at Georgetown. I teach courses, my research is on African politics and African business, actually, but I teach courses all across the spectrum. Things like business and politics in Africa for those who are interested in the investment side, or African Americans in Africa for those who are interested in the transatlantic and diaspora relations. I teach a really fun course called Afrofuturism, which looks at the works of Octavia Butler, Nadia Brown, music by Parliament Funkadelic, and we have a really good time. So even though I'm narrow in terms of my research interests, I like to have a lot of fun in the classroom. Like I said, I didn't become a political scientist from dreaming from the 4th grade. I kind of fell into it accidentally. It was the best department at the school I attended undergrad. And so I just went with the professors that I liked and who were exciting. But I became interested in African studies, and particularly in the research in Africa from a study abroad program. And I hope all of you will, whether you matriculate to Georgetown or not, will take the advantage of going outside of the US and seeing the world from a different perspective. And so I decided, after a brief segue after undergrad, to make some money and pay off some student loans. I came back to school to study Africa, and I've been doing it ever since.
Thank you so much. And I'll just say for myself, I don't have no idea what I wanted to do. I mean, I remember clearly I had no idea what I wanted to do when I started college. Then I sort of thought I might major in comparative literature, wait for it. But then I decided that what the through line of my life is I'm interested in people's behavior and why they do things they do. So I majored in social science and sociology in undergrad. But then it turns out that I'm interested in how that's portrayed in art. So I ended up doing a comparative literature PhD. So I think the kernel of what was to be was there, and I didn't realize it at the time. And now I advise students. So now I sort of do other things with folks' behavior, hopefully in positive ways. So let's jump in and get to the meat of it. We know that you guys are getting a lot of information as you're trying to make this decision in terms of what college to go to. And so we just kind of want to cut to it and just address what I think the faculty hopes you get out of this section, which is like, what is the most important thing they think you should know about Georgetown? And I think we want to start out with Professor Elmendorf and then go to Professor Taylor. So Professor Elmendorf, what is the thing that you want students to know about Georgetown from this session?
I thought we were going to get like a little bit of notice when we were next up here, Javier. Things that we want students to know. So I'd say there's two things. So I'm going to say one thing that I think just applies wherever you go to school. So I think there's this perception in high school that like the teachers are the ones you go to kind of casually and you can like pop in and get help and talk to them about your life and things like that. And then I think there's this perception that when you go to college, that's not who professors are, that we're somehow, I don't know, like distant and mysterious people. At least that's what I thought when I went to college. So I'd say wherever you go, you should go out of your way to make sure that you get to know professors. Go to all the office hours, go up after class and strike up a conversation. It doesn't have to be brilliant. We love teaching because we love students, and we just like students' ideas. And I think almost every idea I've ever heard from a student is great. So I would always get to know your professors. The Georgetown version, I'd say, I don't really know why we're doing this panel because you should really pick a school based on your fellow students. I think that you get so much out of not just outside the classroom, but inside the classroom from your peers. And I think the real strength of Georgetown is in the incredible students that we have at Georgetown.
Thank you so much. Professor Taylor?
I mean, I'd second that, but I'd also add, you know, I'm not a Jesuit and I'm not even Catholic, but I do admire Georgetown's Jesuit traditions. Sometimes we're still striving to reach those Jesuit ideals of care for the whole person and men and women for others and these other sort of highfalutin terms. But I really do think after 20 years here, I do think that those values are held by a lot of the students here, that they really are people for others, that they care about human beings, that they want to go out in the world and do stuff that benefits humanity. I think those are values that are substantially inculcated in the faculty and administration of the school. And so, we're not perfect, and the school's made a lot of errors, and some of which, you know, in my current capacity, I'm charged with helping to address. But you know, I think that there's an effort to, you know, the Constitution says to be a more perfect union. I think there is an effort and a genuine commitment at Georgetown to continue to try to improve and to live up to those values. And I think we do a pretty decent job. And so I think that that's a quality that this school has that a lot of other schools frankly don't. And the other thing I would say, and this is just for me as a person who's internationally oriented, as I hope many of you will be, is that there is no better place, in my view, in the United States to study the world, particularly as a political scientist, but in a lot of other fields as well, than from Washington, D.C. It's about the best place you can get in the US to being someplace else in the world. So that's it.
Thank you so much. Professor Wesley-Nero?
Thanks, Javier. One of the interesting things about this question is just last night for the program I mentioned, I direct the Education Inquiry and Justice program. We had an alumni panel, and I asked them like what was unique now that they're out of college. We had alumni from 2014 every year up until 2020, and I said, what makes your preparation at Georgetown unique than the peers and colleagues you get to work with or learn among at this point? And they actually pointed to the two things, one that Heidi said and one that Scott said. And they said, one, the Jesuit values, again, not that we've arrived, but at least we have a North Star, and that's what we're working toward, even in our mistakes, but also that's what our students hold us accountable for. And they're like, it was clear, like we could say, you're not doing this to Georgetown, or you're not doing it well enough. So they found that having that orientation was good, and their peers, that even particularly in my field, that is an interdisciplinary field in the program that I direct, there are students whose major are from all over the university, and they're all bringing this diversity of experience, but also diversity of training and preparation in their majors to the study of that, and how to wrestle with some of these Jesuit values and core principles, and then the content that they're learning with diverse learners. They're like, those are the two things that when I get out into the world, I realize people maybe don't have these same values, or they don't have the experience of learning with people from different backgrounds or different disciplinary lens. So that was the two things my students just said last night. So I'm going to borrow their answer and go with that.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Wesley-Nero. Professor Brown?
I'm a little different because I'm not actually at Georgetown yet, so I could share what I see thus far and what drew me to leave Purdue and to come to Georgetown. So one, I was just really blown away by the faculty that's here, right? It's world-class faculty, and when I came for my interview, having the opportunities to talk with faculty and learn that they were just some really down-to-earth, kind-hearted folks who really, didn't wear a pedigree on their sleeve and say, "Oh, I'm at Georgetown and you're coming here from another university." It was very, very welcoming, and people were engaging. They cared, and I had, now will be future colleagues follow up, text me just to ask, did I make it back to Indiana okay, right? Just that kind of deep caring is something that you often don't find in the academy. Unfortunately, academics, right, we're experts in something so narrow that oftentimes it sometimes looks like navel gazing, right? And that you're just looking down at your own things and not up at others and around you. And that wasn't the case. So I immediately felt like part of a community, and I thought, I want to be part of this. The other thing that drew me to Georgetown was an opportunity to grow and change something. So I'm going to direct the Women Studies Center, the program, and it's in need of some new leadership, right? But the university is willing to bring in some new eyes, a different kind of vision, and seeseems to be open to some suggestions that I have, which means that it's not static, right? That it's looking to change and to grow. And since it was announced that I was accepting this position, I've been embraced open arms, right? So clearly I'm doing this panel. I am not a faculty member yet. I have been doing panels like these, since the fall. Even this summer, I started talking with students and other faculty. And really, what's so different are the students that sought me out, right? So they had to look up my bio, find the way to contact me, and did. And then they set up meeting times to talk with me. And we've had a couple of virtual happy hours where I've met with the Black Survivors Coalition, and I've learned about their issues and things that they think, new leadership in this program would mean. And that's dedication, right? That's something that is unlike what I think most undergrads are doing. And particularly when students have experienced hurt or disappointment, to see their hopefulness and trying to build something better because they love this institution. So that for me is like, yes, I want to be here. These are people who care and want to make a difference. And if you are trying to make something better as opposed to standing on the sidelines and just complaining, those are the kind of people that I want to be around. And I hope that you are like that too.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown. And I just want to express my gratitude for you willing to, do this panel and all the other activities you've been doing before you even got to Georgetown. I know that it can be really tough to be leading one job and starting another one and working that out. Professor Nadia Meissner?
Yeah, so some things, to be real, when I first got to Georgetown, I found it extremely intimidating. It's a predominantly white institution on a coast I had never been to, as far away from my home as you could actually even get and still be in the continental United States. And no joke, the campus looks like Titanic and like Hogwarts are mixed together in these cathedrals, and it's really, really intimidating, not only because it's so different from where I grew up. It's also, there's a big discrepancy, I think, among our students in the comfort level they have asking for help and knowing how to look for certain sorts of resources. I will say that as far as I can tell, the resources are there. It's a matter of figuring out how to navigate the space. So coming to Georgetown, I would advise that that a prospective student would consider all of the avenues that they have to look and ask for resources, as well as to be committed to investing in building community, not only inside of your academic situation, but also outside, because sometimes that siloing of being at a school where, you know, a lot of people look and talk in certain sorts of ways can be really alienating. So to make sure that you're always still building community inside and outside of the academy. And then another thing that just stands out so much about the amazing students I've had the opportunity to work with these last 2 years is the compassion they have for one another, the passion they have for social justice and for righting the wrongs of the world, and just the true amount of coalition building I see as possible between the student groups here. It's just really been impressive. And, you know, every day I go home and I go to sleep, and I know the reason I'm going to get up that next day is because of the student passion and the student activism that I just love to see flourishing in a space like this.
Thank you so much. My next question was going to be about academics and teaching and learning and research, but I actually think that I'm going to jump to the question that I think is probably one that we want to talk about and we want to address. And basically, it's about how to support students and how to work with students, particularly in the context that we find ourselves in right now. We have had a very, I think to put it mildly, tumultuous year between a pandemic, between really serious political changes and events that some of them which we've never seen before in our nation's history, a racial reckoning that is at least two generations in the making, but also carries a whole prehistory behind that. And of course, as human beings, you know, we and students are trying to navigate this moment. So as faculty, how do you support students through this very specific historical moment? I think I'm going to start out with Professor Taylor.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in my current role, well, let me start as a professor, sort of, and the lens as a professor dealing with students, indeed with our whole community at very, very difficult times like this. I mean, when we're hurting as a community or as individual members of that community, the first and most important thing I think a professor can do for students is to hear them, to be willing to listen, to be sensitive to their concerns, to help provide solutions if possible, but first just to be available. And I remember in 2016, after the election, a lot of my students were incredibly distraught. Some were first gen, a number were undocumented, a number were LGBTQ, and they were worried about what the next 4 years meant for them. And we spent, you know, basically a week in class and out of class, and people came to my office. I became a counselor, in effect, for quite some time after that election, just like working through problems, thinking about coping strategies and so on, and just being available. In the current context with the racial violence, you know, Black Lives Matter, and the resurgence of national awakening that took place last summer, and the anti-Asian violence that we've seen now, the pervasive racism that has gripped this country since the founding, but is particularly on all our minds now. Again, that necessity of listening, of directing, having students channel activism productively in the classroom, giving readings and having discussions and debates about contemporary issues. And so how do we engage with these issues productively as a community? How do we move this country and the world forward? Those kinds of questions are always critical to engage with in a university setting. In my current role, I don't want to take too much time on answering the question, but in my current role, I'm the Vice Dean of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion in the School of Foreign Service. This position was created in response to the upheaval last summer. One could argue Georgetown is 233 years old, that this kind of position is 233 years late, but better late than never. And so let's like try, what I try to do now is interact with different groups, whether identity groups, students, I've been meeting with students regularly in this role to hear their concerns. We're trying to come up with action plans to address issues of diversity at Georgetown, to make people feel more included, to be more culturally sensitive. So we're making progress on all these spheres within my school and across the university, but it takes a lot of time, and it takes an incredible amount of sort of constant engagement, being willing to listen and being available. So there's a lot more, but I don't want to hog the mic, but if anybody wants to talk to me about this, I'm more than welcome to.
Thank you so much. Professor Wesley-Nero?
Yeah, so in my classes, I think I want to build on something that Professor Taylor shared. Like, you have to see the students. So that Jesuit value we mentioned about kind of whole person or care for the whole person, I feel we talk about educating the whole person. And so I explicitly integrate issues of wellness into my courses. And we name the fact that if we are really talking about educational opportunities for all students, and that actually includes my students, right? Then we need to talk about whole person education. So first you have to see the student. It's what I believe, just as Professor Scott Taylor mentioned, but also help them figure out what I've been really focused on is like help them understand that if they're not concerned with their wellness, their education is also going to suffer. So how do I make that center and explicit and very clear that this is part of me helping you be successful at this school, is helping you think about these things. And then the last thing, because I really want to hear what my colleagues want to share about this question too, is that particularly in this moment, I ask my students what they think they need, but for now and next, right? So, because this moment is a moment, and if we are really dealing with a whole person education, we're going to come out of this moment. So what do you need right now? And then what do you need for your next opportunity, the next change you want to bring, the next success you want to harness? So that's been the frame, aiming toward wellness as a part of the education and success in the classes that I teach, and then helping the students think about the now and the next.
Thank you so much. Professor Brown?
So yeah, I'll piggyback on a lot of what's already said. So rather than just kind of rehash, I'll talk a little bit about what I have done. I think all of the things that both Professor Taylor and Wesley-Nero have shared are spot on. So for me, I found that being upfront about how I've struggled with teaching online, moving online through COVID has really been a space for students to come and talk to me about it. So I have 3 kids, 5, 3, and 1. My father-in-law died of cancer in December, but because of COVID restrictions, right, we weren't able to do anything, and my husband went home to LA for a month and a half to like settle, his father's things and help him. And I've lost, like many other Black and Brown folks, I've lost countless numbers of family members to COVID, and we haven't been able to mourn because we haven't been able to bury them. And so, I share these things with my students because I think it lets them know that they are, whatever they're struggling with, right? Faculty are people too, and they're struggling with it as well. But then also, I hope that it instills some grace that students give to me, right? So we're all operating under this new Zoom classroom. And if I don't answer an email as soon as you send it, it might be because I'm homeschooling an e-kindergartner, right? And so it's just having like the building perspective that just as Professor Wesley-Nero sees you as a holistic student, I also want you to see me as a holistic person and a professor. I also build in wellness days in my class, and I do routine check-ins. So we spend 20 minutes, hey, what's up, what's going on, and truly caring and listening to people. And I teach courses in gender, feminism, Black women's studies. And so this is a Black feminist care, an ethic of care. And so it's not just lip service. I write about these things, but I actually build these into the pedagogy and how I teach. And then lastly, in dealing with or thinking about social justice, it feels like it was a spotlight after this summer, right after George Floyd was murdered and after Breonna Taylor, the grand jury failed to indict. And it felt like a spotlight of, white faculty and administrators wanting to say, I'm sorry to Black women and Black students, but not actually do anything, right? Just want to like absolve themselves of white guilt. And so some of my commitment to social justice is how do I help the institutions be accountable, right? There's more than just saying, I'm sorry, I feel bad, but what are some things that that folks can do? And then also working with my BIPOC students, let them know you are not the savior. You do not have to absolve anyone of their guilt, right? You can say no when you're asked to serve on a committee that will not reward you or just take up your time. And so, right, thinking about the things that we do for social justice out in the world, like, are you donating to good causes? Are you protesting and writing letters to your congresspeople? But then also in the institution, right? What are you doing to make your institution a better place? And I think they're just different and complicated rules of engagement depending on your own social identity, the privilege, and the marginalization that your identity brings with it.
Thank you so much. Professor Nadia Meissner, please.
Yes, of course, I want to echo everything that everyone else has already said. These are wonderful answers that I'm taking notes. I'm learning a lot here. I teach Indigenous philosophy courses, almost all of which are about resistance movements. So they're already pretty heavy material. We're talking about genocide and violence against Indigenous women, climate catastrophe, just this really heavy topic. So it's always been really important to me to build wellness into my classes. But then with COVID and then all of the stuff, the hellscape we've been through the last couple years, it's been really, really important, I think, to center community building, to cultivate opportunities for students to really build community with one another, and then also to build in reciprocity to my final projects, where instead of the students just doing an extractive research project on some resistance movement, I'm asking my students to form partnerships, to form coalitions, so they learn about the communities that they're in and around every single day. Very much like Dr. Brown just said, instead of this lip service type of academic contribution, what can we actually do? And I found my students find these projects very, very rewarding because they get to see the tangibles, they get to see their power of their demands, they get to see the effects on the material conditions of marginalized communities that they have the ability to direct resources to, even as undergraduates at an institution like Georgetown. So that's been a really, really meaningful thing to watch them through all of this, really be inspired to work together inside and outside of the academy.
Thank you so much. And Professor Elmendorf?
I feel like maybe I should just say like amen at the end of like what all my colleagues said, because I think maybe one thing as a prospective student you can take away is that we actually are just all speaking the same language, despite the fact that we're kind of scattered across the campus, right? So when you hear a consistent message, that helps tell you that it's an institutional value, not just like a personal individual's value. I think a lot of what you've been hearing about, right, is the cura personalis at Georgetown. And I think, so I think as faculty, we have a couple of obligations. I think it's important that we figure out how to create a sense of belonging in all classrooms, not ones that are just overtly dealing with issues of peoples and cultures and humanities, but I teach our foundations in biology class, which is about molecules and cells and DNA. And it's incredibly important that that class is a class in which welcomes people, right? Which welcomes students and their whole selves, and creates a way for them to feel a sense of belonging within the discipline that they love, right? That it's not just something separate from them, so they're them and their identities, and there's this thing about biology that they love, but that they can find a way to bring their whole self and feel that that's fully integrated with their love of the science. I think if we want students to bring their whole selves as faculty, we need to bring our whole selves in. And so you've already heard this from my colleagues, but I just think it's incredibly important. One of the things that I do in my classes, there's a project on our campus called the Engelhardt Project that's about mental wellness being infused into the curriculum. And my course is one of the courses that's part of it. My students do research into a topic of mental wellness of their choosing. They look at the scientific basis of it, genetics and environment. And so I talk openly about my own struggles with mental health, because I think if I'm inviting my students into that space, then we need to lead the way. I'd also like to echo this idea about listening, and in particular, kind of taking action when you listen. So one of the things, colleges and universities are hierarchical. And when you're a faculty member, you have privilege. And you have actually extraordinary privilege. And I think one of the things that we need to always keep in mind when we listen to students is to then act with that privilege on behalf of our students, to leverage our privilege to help change the institution. And so I think you've heard from all of us that we are clearly listeners, but we're also people who are trying to figure out how to take what we hear and change the institution to be the place that we want it to be, the place that lives up to those Jesuit ideals that we talk about.
Thank you so much. I'm really not like a super touchy-feely person, but I'm really wish that I could just sort of be in this panel and keep talking to you all for like the rest of the day and maybe the rest of the week, because I'm so inspired by everything that you've said, especially because it resonates for me, I think, in terms of the values and the things that we are trying to do at Georgetown. I want to pick up on just a couple of things, something that Professor Taylor said and something that Professor Brown said, which is about our Jesuit values, and it's also about taking ownership of the institution. Compared to like a state school that may not have a specific of a mission as a place like Georgetown does, our values are there for everyone to see. And you are not just part of the community that's going to be tacked on. You're going to be an integral part of the community as a student and later as an alum. And so you should hold us accountable to those values. We're going to hold you accountable to your papers that you have to write and when they're due, but you should hold us accountable to the goals and the mission, our educational mission, and what we think is important. So I just kind of wanted to sort of highlight those things, but I think everything all of the faculty members have said is wonderful. I think now we are going to move on to Q&A. So we're going to open this up for you all who are thinking about where to go to college to ask questions. You can do so over Zoom. You can ask the question live like this, or you can ask the question via the chat. We're happy to take any of those questions. And maybe as those sort of start percolating up, we could here and there talk a little bit about academics. Perhaps, colleges and universities are the kinds of places where we are not only sharing knowledge with students, but we're also creating knowledge as well, which is to say that we're teaching students like the things that they absolutely need to know about our disciplines, but we also are exposing them to the cutting edge ideas and research and new things. And so I just kind of want to open it up to the faculty. How do you do that? How do you guide students through like the foundational stuff and also like the cutting edge stuff that's just like wows you and them? And you should feel free to speak whenever you like.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in on this one. Well, I think they're the same thing. Or I think you have to treat them as though they're the same thing. Nobody's a biologist because of what we know. People are biologists because of what we don't know. And so if you don't infuse that sense of discovery and kind of wonder and creativity into the foundational work, then nobody's going to stick around. But that's where all the excitement is. And also I should say, I guarantee that every single fact in a biology textbook that I teach from this year, somebody is actively researching to figure out how true it is and under what circumstances it's true. So this idea that, we just know everything, we write it in textbooks and that's what should happen in an intro level course, that's just ridiculous, I think. So yeah, this isn't just Georgetown, folks. Wherever you go, make sure that they think that the game from day one is about the excitement of the discovery. And that's not something saved for the upper years or the few privileged, but it's just built into the experience.
My answer might differ a bit as a social scientist, because the foundational stuff is deeply problematic and flawed, right? Like white supremacy reigns supreme in the kind of like, this is the best book that you need to read to understand Congress. And it's like, yeah, it leaves out all like women and BIPOC folk, queer folk, right? Like, so, and that starts young, right? So it's not just what do you teach in intro to poli-sci, but it's how did you learn civics or history? And when students come to college, I mean, I find it exciting to reprogram, right? To kind of like to take it all back. Like, no, right? Like, do you ever think about, right? Kind of like the facts that you were taught and why people that look like you weren't represented? And let's kind of play back, right? Like, what were people that looked like you, identified like you identify? What were they doing around this time period? And how do we integrate this? And my specialty is American politics, right? So how do you integrate this into American politics? And this was, I went to Howard University also in DC, right? So just right the other side of the district. And so that was an education that I got at Howard, and I didn't even have to ask for it, right? It was just baked in as a HBCU. But when I started graduate school, I was serving as a teaching assistant in Introduction to American Government. I had some Latinx students and some first gen international students come up and just ask, like, we've read 4 chapters thus far and no one else said, like, there's no mention of people that look like me or have my experience. What's this about? And I was like, yes, right, let's talk about this. But I recognized in that point that it was empowering for those students to see a teaching assistant that looked like me. And then I felt very blessed and privileged to be able to have an answer and respond to them, right? So because of the education that I got at Howard and, through my parents and those of my community members, right, I was able to say, well, yeah, just because it is what's in the textbook, it doesn't, right, really fully speak to the complexities of the founding of our nation. And so we started a little reading group, right? Like I think it was 6 of us at the time. And that was really eye-opening for me. I think it was my second year at graduate school. But ever since then, I was like, I will never teach where people identities are erased. I will never teach a class where people can't see themselves or feel empowered to ask the teacher, why aren't they there, right? Again, those students came to me, a graduate student, a teaching assistant, not the professor. And I never wanted to be someone who wasn't seen as accessible. So yeah, so for me, exposing students to the cutting edge stuff is like the things that are happening right now, and yeah, the things that were published in 2021. And that is really, really important. But it's also important not to just teach the standard, the canonical texts, right? The seminal works that everyone says, well, you can't be a political scientist if you don't study Mayhew and Fenno. And I'm like, well, yeah, I can critique them. I have to read them to critique them, but right, I want you to have a strong sense of who you are and where your identity and your history fits into understanding that those canonical texts, are flawed and they perhaps should not be canonical. And so I'm all about decolonizing the academy.
Yeah, I think one of the things I would add for that question is in my classes, I try to, because in education, right, we know there's disparity in education. We know it's along the lines of culture and race and class and language and region. And we know that our educational institutions were not created with everyone in mind. Like, we've been pushing and expanding the definition of education for all, like, by who do we mean by all, like, since we started schools. So in my classes, what I want them to do and I introduce them to is almost competing frameworks. Like, we do systems thinking, we do multiple frameworks, and they're like, wait, this is like, you gave us readings and they say the opposite things. I'm like, if there was one answer, we wouldn't need this entire program, right? Like, so you have to wrestle with that. And it's like, my job is not to tell you the right way. If I knew what the right way was, I'd go out and fix it, right? My job is to get you to think about what are the foundational commitments that undergird this particular philosophy or policy in education or practice. And then the other kind of signature pedagogy, the program I direct, we really lean into is, and they take what they're learning with us on campus and they're working in schools in DC. We call it community-based learning. So part of many of my courses, they partner with local schools. And some of the students in my class, they walk into DC public schools, and the ones that we partner with, and the students look just like them, right? And some of my students in my class, they go into DC schools and they've never been in a school that was 98% African-American or that had multiple languages spoken in the hallway. And we go and we wrestle with what that means. And they may partner with an educational opportunity, a nonprofit organization or a government organization, and think about how is this policy impacting different sectors of the community differently, and why are we doing it that way, right? So we have to ask these broad questions and wrestle with like conflicting paradigms to figure out how we're going to move it toward equity. And that starts at the intro class of the program all the way to the end. So we can't wait for that. So there's no like, for us, there is foundational knowledge, but it's like, it's not settled. It's like wrestling with the contradictions between them.
Oh, you want
Professor Taylor, Professor Nowlet, Meissner, whoever wants to go next.
Oh, you want to go first? No? Okay. Yeah, that's so, you know, to echo what my colleagues have said about sort of decolonizing the curriculum is not just political science, it's all of our curriculum. One of my roles now is to work across programs and faculty in the School of Foreign Service, but again, outside as well, about have you looked at your syllabus? have you looked at the authors? Have you looked at the perspectives on your syllabus? Are you teaching the same syllabus you taught 20 years ago? Or have you included, you know, more voices, more perspectives, people of color, different genders, you know, and so a lot of faculty members are taking that advice now, some very belatedly, but they're doing that hard work of kind of decolonizing their syllabi. For me, as a professor in a field of, you know, political science, but of Africa and looking at African studies, it's not as easy as it sounds, because the African studies and the area studies curriculum, whatever area of the world you're looking at, has historically been, by definition, very colonial. But now with, you know, when I teach my courses on Africa, for example, the vast majority of my authors are African, right? So you know, I want students to hear from Africans themselves as we present, you know, these different perspectives. So we're getting to a place, whether in area studies, Asia, Africa, Latin America, where indigenous voices can rise to the fore and often tell a very, very different story from the northern, predominantly white, predominantly male voices that have dominated so many fields in the past. So we are advancing the way we deliver education. And again, I think it's not to eliminate those northern white male voices, but to also present a counterbalance to them. So, you know, echo what Dr. Brown said. I mean, I wouldn't want to throw out Hegel, for example, but Hegel said Africans are childlike and there's no history to be seen in Africa except the history of Europeans, right? So I think Hegel was wrong on that front, and I now can marshal a lot of authors to show exactly how wrong he was, right? Then in my classes to kind of engage students. So I'm a political scientist, but I don't feel, and I'm fortunate in my field and in my school to teach basically elective courses. I don't have to teach, you know, comparative politics, the big 150 student class. I can teach smaller, more elective oriented courses. And what I do is not just present different authors and different views, but different disciplines. So I'm teaching political science, but I'll bring in a work of fiction. I'll bring in film. I will bring in, you know, in addition to social science, I will invite, you know, political leaders, the ambassadors who populate Washington, D.C. to come in to talk to my students. A year and a half ago, for my freshman, I brought in President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, from the first female president of Africa, the former president of Liberia, you know, to come talk to them, to give them a different flavor than simply reading a political science textbook on Africa. So there are lots of ways to sort of maintain that and enhance that engagement inside and outside the classroom.
Professor Meissner, if you want to close us out.
Sure. I honestly was so excited to listen to everyone. I completely forgot I was on the panel. So I was just like nodding vehemently. I guess I do want to disturb the binary too, that there's a difference between like the old stuff and the cutting edge, especially in something like Indigenous philosophy. I've always found it very absurd that when we talk about ancient philosophy, it's like a very specific type of ancient philosophy. That's usually not going to be Native American philosophy, though, of course, Georgetown sits on Native land, and that philosophy is, you know, older than most of the ancient philosophy that we think of. So decolonization isn't new. There's nothing new under the sun. So I really want to kind of destabilize the binary. I think that Indigenous philosophy is cutting edge and always has been. And yeah, I'm just excited to be on this panel. Also, I would probably throw out Hegel, but that's just me.
I'm a political science. We're not allowed to throw.
Okay, fair.
Well, as a conflict person, I will throw out Hegel. So we've done it. You can do it too. So I don't think we have enough time to get questions from students. Unfortunately, I hope that we didn't. You can tell that we like to talk. So I hope we did not intimidate you from speaking or from submitting questions. However, we do encourage you to get in touch with any one of us by email and ask us any questions you would like. If the faculty could please drop their email addresses on the chat, please, that would be fantastic. And in closing, I would just like to say to everyone here, we are so appreciative that you came here today on Zoom during a pandemic to listen to us, to learn more about Georgetown, to learn more about how you might imagine yourself here with us on the Hilltop. I want to extend my gratitude to all of the wonderful faculty members who took time out of their Saturdays to come in and to share and to be vulnerable with prospective students, Professor Wesley-Nero, Professor Elmendorf, Professor Brown, Professor Nadia Brown, Professor Taylor, thank you so much for your time today. And yeah, I would just say to everyone here in the audience, we love you guys. We want you to come to Georgetown. If you have questions, please get in touch with us. Thank you so much. I think I'm gonna send it back to Bella.